about 3 trillion in assets, or about 20% of the economy in value, is still held by the SOE in Europe, and Sweden leads that. And in Sweden, they had taken a challenge of showing that how government-owned enterprises can function as effective as private-owned enterprises. And then I think during that period, as you were saying, that he probably proved that they can function better. He also talked about the Chinese experience when China, before they started privatization, 100% of all the assets were owned by the government. It came down to about 50% as on now, with private companies being allowed to function there. But what has happened is they have formed 2 holding companies. One is Sasang and the other Qijing. I hope I got it right. One in the manufacturing area, one in the financial sectors. These companies have been, as we all know, hugely successful, and they are now going about buying up the assets all over the world. He also said that the SOEs in Europe are currently underperforming, and the reason for that is not the ownership, that there are other issues. He talked about the various principles, like various classifications, the utilities, the value creation which is needed for these companies. Utilities basically have to look at the service rather than the profit, and the value creation in the case of businesses, commercial business, and the international business division, how it has been divided. And in Sweden, he talked about the most important factors if SOEs have to really function effectively. He did emphasize the need for transparency, and most importantly, the need for single objective. This is something very dear to me, because I have been also talking about it in Kerala, that I always say if you have one objective, your chance of success is near 100%, and whereas we have about 25-30 objectives, and that's a problem. If you have 2 objectives, you go into 2 different directions. Imagine when you have 25-30 objectives. That's the problem we probably are having in India. Well, he did talk about the experience in Lithuania, how they have put up a very, very ambitious target of almost 20% profit coming, and how it is used to offset the deficit. Very ambitious, I should say. And he did paint the picture of the wheel of commerce and how these challenges are to be sort of met. Talked about 3 important points there. The political insulation is something similar, almost similar to Dr. Alternan said, about how to monitor but not to sort of interfere in the day-to-day management. Thus, in a different way, he talked about the political insulation of the SOEs, which is very important if they have to function effectively. But at the same time, they should have very clear objectives. You give them an objective, you give them the target, allow them to function, and then monitor it later. And of course, the most important, all this can work only if there is transparency. He said very euphemistically, the issue of transparency is something which is being haunting us in this part of the world especially, and rest of the world also. He also talked about the regulation and separation, separating the regulation and the ownership. Just because you are the owner, you also don't get into regulation. Regulations are probably across the board, across all the companies. Ownership objectives are different. Well, these are mostly, he also talked about the holding companies, which I mentioned earlier. Well, basically, I haven't covered all the points, but generally these were the points which were covered by the speakers. Now we will move on to the other side, where in about 10 minutes time each, our discussants will be throwing more light on these points and adding more to that with their own points of view. We will start with Mr. Philip Tienko, who has come from Kuala Lumpur. Mr. Philip, please. Thank you.
Very good afternoon, Mr. Shuri and learned members of the panel. And thank you for still being here, Your Excellency. I see you still sitting there and listening, and many of you. It's a pleasure to be here in the land of the gods, where the gods dwell. As I was flying in, I read a book called In Spite of the Gods. And I think that as I listened in this morning, I realized that gods are there, no doubt, and we honor them. But it is through human agency that we learn many, many things. And as I listen into the passion of the presentation, I'm learning from India, the new and the old. And I thought that I will introduce my discussion point by a few slides. E.P. Thompson, an English historian, says, there is not a thought that is being thought in the West or the East that is not active in some Indian mind. But this morning I heard many Indian minds and actions by the Kerala state government, and I realized that they too are engaging on the enterprise of elevating the suffering of our common humanity. I bought a book while waiting for 5 hours in Chennai airport, the selections of writings and by Ramachandra Guha, and this little quotation jumped up to me. He said that in India there are 5 revolutions simultaneously occurring: the urban, the industrial, the democratic, and the social. As I hear these 3 themes, it resonates with what is happening in Malaysia. Malaysia too undergoes these 5 simultaneous revolutions. And I think Malaysia could draw many lessons from India, as India perhaps could draw from Malaysia. Personally, I have many friends whose ancestors, fathers and mothers came from this very state itself, and they are my very close bosom friends in Kuala Lumpur. My dear friend Dr. Rizal have explained that Malaysia has the public enterprises, and in post-57, all right, the equation seems to be that the Malay leadership will take political primacy, while the non-Malays, dominated by the Chinese, would concentrate in the commerce. But May 13 riots and the crisis of political leadership among the Malays made the Malays realize that they too would like to cut into the economic pie. And so the second Prime Minister, the father of our current Prime Minister, Tun Razak, our current Prime Minister is Najib Razak, then introduced what we call the affirmative action through the new economic policy. In 69 to 70, the role of public enterprise in Malaysia was defined strongly, and part of its strategy is to reduce and eventually eliminate the identification of race with economic functions, and that the rapid advancement of the word Bumiputra, which is prince of the soul, or the indigenous people, to about 30% equity control of the total commercial and industrial activities. There is therefore in all of Malaysia renovations and innovations in SOEs a political economic dimension. An early political scientist, Bruce Gale, argued, and I note that my friend Jomo used the word patrimonial too, a patrimonial model for the understanding of Malaysian political process. The ruling elite confers favors on followers in return for gifts and steady income. They devolve power and delegated authority, resulting in holders of office at times seeking profits and rents, and personal rulership rather than a rational rule norms, resulting in the centralization of power and weak institutional checks. So Asian bureaucracy and Malaysian is penetrated with a network of political patronage and client relationship, perhaps no more, no less than many emergent economies. So what is the quest for an ideal model? And Bruce Gale put it quite well. Whatever may be the social, cultural, and political implications, the ideal for Malaysia as a nation state to be united clearly involves a successful encouragement and integration of the dominant community, which is the Malays, to play a full part in economic life, and public enterprise has been chosen as its instrument. But 98 crisis is the key in a way to understand the major 90s changes, what we call the transformation program. And it has been helpfully summarized in a text which you can download from OECD website, Policy Brief on Corporate Governance of State-Owned Enterprise in Asia. I recommend you to download that, www.oecd.org/DAF/corporate-affairs. You could download a helpful policy brief on corporate governance in Asia and boxes describing Malaysian experience. Another website in this slide, which if you don't remember anything from what I say, just copy it down and perhaps download from there, is www.pcg.gov.my/trans_manual.asp. There you can download the Khazanah, which is the holding company set up by our Ministry of Finance Inc., the chief holding investment company for our government-linked corporations. the GLCs under Khazanah has undertaken bold programs to enhance what they call a G20, and this is not a G20 of our Great Economic Summit, but 20 key public listed companies of our stock exchange. And under this GLC program, and now 19, because Sime Darby has merged with Guthrie, and we have now 19, we have also the telecoms demerger. They are supposed to be the catalyst for growth and stimulus. In a midterm review of Khazanah, Khazanah reports that the G20 total shareholder returns continue to outperform the Kuala Lumpur Stock Index by a compounded annual growth rate of 4.8% since the launch of the program. G20 return on equity grew from 8.2% from the year of 2004 to 10.4% to 2008, peaking at 14.6% in 2007. The G20 PLCs also had shown significant improvement in economic profits, turning around from an aggregate economic loss of 3.5 billion to an economic profit of ringgit 1.3 billion in the year 2008. Several GLCs have successfully undertaken sizable operational turnaround programs. The MAS, the Bank Islam, bold transformational move to enhance positions like Sime Darby merger, telecoms demerger, and the UEM restructuring. And regional expansions hinted of by YRK Reddy is also taking place by GLCs themselves, the financial entities called Maybank and CIMB being one of those chief trusts to do cross-border regionalization. In the second and third phase, we have in 2005 to end 2006, 10 initiatives signified by a very colorful program. All these are done by this sexy consultant group called McKinsey, I guess, called the Green Book Program, which is enforcement of board effectiveness, Silver Book Program, guidelines of revamp of CSR program, procurement, Red Book, operational management, yellow and brown, and orange for capital management. All these color books, again, may be downloadable at the Khazanah website, and I urge you to avail yourself without paying McKinsey price. Just use it, contextualize it, and perhaps enjoy the outcome of it. The future, and I would like to close shortly, I know I have only 10 minutes. I think the future, indeed, the GLCs have to enhance performance, to continue to promote results orientation. Headline key performance indicators annually have been showing overall improvements despite the harsh economic environment. But the challenges, I'd like to just pause here. All is not hunky-dory. Obviously, when you go to our website, you read wonderful news, all right? Some of it is propaganda, some of it is factual. But for us who are citizens in my country, we know that all is not well in the house of Denmark, all right? We have, within the GLCs, various corporate governance debacle. Sime Darby tries to go in oil and gas to the Middle East, and they found themselves completely shortchanged in their ability to monitor their performance of those entities. There are also incomplete rescues and bailouts, what we hinted of earlier using the word social cost absorption by the public purse. Inadequate monitoring and supervisory competencies. Golden shares still prevail in many of these entities despite its attempt to be listed and corporatized. My friend Rizal talked about the problems of nominee directorship, weak market discipline given monopolistic and oligopoly tendencies, supply-side driven developments. UEM has a huge land bank next to Singapore, but it's really supply-side driven and not demand assessed, weak when compared to private sector. With those concluding words, I'd like to say that as I listen in once again, there's this lovely phrase from the book In Spite of Gods. The Indians thought about it too. In practice, it may work, but what about in theory? I guess throughout this today, we are wrestling the relationship between theory and practice, outcomes and realities within the framing of our desires for better governance of state-owned enterprise. And with those words, I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ko. And now we will move to Dr. Otiu Igbuzor from Nigeria. Dr. Igbuzor.
I want to thank the organizers for this very important conference. I want to preface my comments by saying that from the discussions this morning, I think that three clear issues have emerged. The first is that strengthening, reorganization, and restructuring of state-owned enterprises as an alternative to privatization is influenced by the ideology, commitment, and political will of the government. The second issue is that from the presentations this morning, empirical evidence indicates that privatization is neither a good alternative to poor-performing SOE, nor is it as successful as the apostles of privatization we want us to believe. The third issue is that the success of Kerala in management of state-owned enterprises is a result of ideological commitment and a proper institutional framework that allows for effective and efficient management. It is against these three issues that my interest in this section on policy development in SOE government is to look at the strategies for effective SOE governance. And the speakers in this section have outlined some strategies that can help in SOE governance, including minor divestment, but government retains control, employee involvement, re-engineering the relationship between SOE and the government, specific SOE governance codes, accounting and auditing standards, OECD guidelines of corporate governance, political insulation, clear objectives, and transparency. For me, I think the great question is how do you create the right environment for the strengthening of SOEs? And it is clear to me that the right condition will determine whether government will pursue a policy of strengthening or a policy of privatization. And this can be illustrated graphically from case studies of two countries in Africa, South Africa and Nigeria. The contrasting development in these two countries shows that the ideology, commitment, and orientation of the government will determine what it will do with regards to SOEs, whether they will be privatized or whether they will be strengthening and restructured. In South Africa, as most of us will know, they started a government which is made up of coalition of the African National Congress and the Communist Party of South Africa. And so the government, despite the Washington consensus that had been talked about, could not go for a full-scale 100% privatization of SOEs. And so the government started a program of restructuring SOEs, including the elements of 1, redesign of business managed principles, 2, turnaround strategies, 3, improving efficiency and effectiveness, 4, assessing globally competitive technologies, 5, ensuring growth in employment, and 6, attracting foreign direct investments. And the result from studies is that there was good financial result from many state-owned enterprises in South Africa. In contrast, Nigerian government have alternated over the years between military and civilian factions of the capitalist class. But if you look at the history of Nigeria, you will notice that the SOEs were actually started and consolidated during colonial rule. And clearly, SOEs were expanded and consolidated from 1946 to 56 during colonial rule, when the Labour Party came to power in the UK. Later in my presentation, I will show the factors that led to the rise and fall of SOEs in Africa. But in Nigeria, by 1999, over $1 billion was already invested in SOEs in Nigeria. But with the Washington Consensus, there was actually a law called Privatization and Commercialization Act of 1988, which was promulgated to sell public enterprises in Nigeria. In fact, in Nigeria, they took it to an extreme, not just selling public enterprises, but selling government houses, selling legislators' houses, and selling everything that government had in the country. The government actually created a bureau by an act of parliament